The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, carried by a postal clerk who seemed unusually somber for such a routine delivery. Catherine Walsh had been expecting correspondence from Montana Territory for weeks, eagerly anticipating news about her upcoming wedding arrangements. What she received instead would shatter every carefully laid plan she had made for her future. But that morning, as golden autumn light filtered through the lace curtains of her modest Boston boarding house room, Catherine had no inkling of the devastation that awaited her. She was busy with final preparations, her trunk half-packed with the finest belongings she could afford, her heart full of hope for the new life that beckoned from the wild frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine Elizabeth Walsh stood before the cracked mirror in her boarding house room, adjusting the pearl buttons on her traveling dress for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The deep green wool complemented her auburn hair, which she had spent an hour arranging into an elaborate chignon that would, she hoped, survive the long journey ahead. At 28, Catherine knew she was considered past the prime marrying age by Boston society standards, but the mirror reflected a woman still possessed of clear blue eyes, smooth skin, and the kind of determined grace that came from years of making her own way in the world. The trunk at the foot of her bed lay open, revealing the carefully folded contents of her entire life. 3 dresses suitable for frontier living, her mother's China tea service wrapped in layers of tissue paper, leather-bound volumes of Shakespeare and Dickens, her teaching certificates, and tucked away in a hidden compartment, the precious bundle of letters that had changed everything. 17 letters in total, each one signed, "Your devoted Samuel Harrison," each one painting a picture of a life Catherine had never dared dream possible. Samuel owned a successful horse ranch outside the growing town of Millfield, Montana Territory. He was a widower of 35, educated back east, but drawn to the freedom of the frontier. His letters spoke of vast open spaces, of wild horses, running free across endless grasslands, of a life where a woman could be more than society's narrow definitions allowed. Catherine lifted the most recent letter, dated just 3 weeks ago, and read again the passage that had sealed her decision. "My dear Catherine, I find myself counting the days until your arrival with an anticipation that surprises me. In your letters, I have found not just intelligence and kindness, but a spirit of adventure that matches my own. The ranch house I have built overlooks a valley where eagles soar and wildflowers bloom in colors you have never seen. I have prepared a place for you here, not just as my wife, but as my partner in building something lasting and meaningful. The frontier may be harsh, but it rewards those brave enough to embrace its challenges." She had written back immediately, accepting his proposal and promising to arrive by the 1st of October. That was yesterday. Today, she would board the train that would carry her away from everything familiar toward a future she could barely imagine. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. "Miss Walsh," called Mrs. Aberdeen, the boarding house proprietor. "Your carriage is here." Catherine's stomach fluttered with nervous excitement as she closed the trunk and secured the leather straps. She had been living in Mrs. Aberdeen's establishment for 3 years, ever since the private school where she taught had closed due to financial difficulties. The boarding house was respectable but modest, housing unmarried working women like herself who lived on the margins of proper society. It had been a refuge of sorts, but never a home. As she descended the narrow staircase, Catherine caught sight of herself in the hall mirror. She looked every inch the proper Boston lady, but beneath the composed exterior, her heart raced with anticipation. She was leaving behind the safety of the known for the promise of something extraordinary. Mrs. Aberdeen waited in the front hall, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "I still say you're mad to go traipsing off to the wilderness, to marry a stranger," she said, but her tone held no real criticism. "Though I suppose you've always been one to follow your own path." Catherine smiled, thinking of the years she had spent trying to conform to society's expectations. After her parents died when she was 22, she had been left with little inheritance and fewer prospects. Teaching had provided respectability and independence, but not the kind of life she truly wanted. Samuel's letters had offered something different: partnership, adventure, purpose, sometimes madness and courage. "Look remarkably similar," Catherine replied, pulling on her traveling gloves. "And I would rather risk everything for the chance at happiness than spend my life wondering what might have been." The carriage ride to the train station took 20 minutes through the familiar streets of Boston. Catherine watched the city pass by with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were already becoming someone else. The brownstone buildings, the cobblestone streets, the properly dressed pedestrians all seemed part of a life that was already slipping into memory. At the station, chaos reigned. Steam locomotives hissed and belched black smoke. Porters shouted instructions over the din, and travelers pressed forward with their luggage and their own urgent destinations. Catherine located the westbound train and found her seat in the ladies' car, a modest accommodation that would be her home for the next 4 days. As the train pulled away from the platform, Catherine pressed her face to the window for one last glimpse of the city where she had spent her entire life. But instead of sadness, she felt only a thrilling sense of liberation. Whatever awaited her in Montana Territory, it would be hers, to discover and shape. The first day of travel passed in a blur of changing landscapes. Rolling New England hills gave way to the broader vistas of New York State, then the endless farmlands of the Midwest. Catherine read, dozed, and talked with her fellow passengers, most of whom were heading west for their own reasons. There was Mrs. Patterson, a widow, joining her son in Denver. Young Mr. Kellerman was seeking his fortune in the gold fields of Colorado. An elderly German immigrant named Mr. Hoffman spoke of fertile farmland in Nebraska, but none of their stories compared to hers. She was traveling toward love, toward a man who had promised her not just marriage, but true partnership. In the evenings, as the train rocked through the darkness, Catherine would read Samuel's letters again, memorizing every detail of the life he described. By the third day, the landscape had transformed completely. Gone were the green forests and rolling hills of the east. In their place stretched vast prairies that seemed to go on forever, broken only by distant mountain ranges that looked like purple shadows against the horizon. The sky was bigger here, more dramatic, painted with clouds that cast moving shadows across the grasslands. Catherine found herself mesmerized by the sheer scale of it all. In Boston, her world had been confined to a few city blocks, her horizons limited by buildings and social conventions. Here, space seemed infinite, full of possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. The other passengers grew quieter as they traveled deeper into the frontier. The comforts of civilization became increasingly distant, replaced by a wild beauty that was both thrilling and slightly intimidating. Towns became smaller and farther apart. The people they glimpsed at station stops looked different too, weathered by sun and wind, dressed more for practicality than fashion. On the evening of the 4th day, the conductor announced they would reach Millfield in the morning. Catherine barely slept that night, excitement and nervousness warring in her chest. Tomorrow, she would meet the man she had agreed to marry, see the ranch that would be her new home, begin the life that had existed only in letters and imagination. She woke before dawn to find the train winding through a valley between rugged hills. The morning light revealed a landscape unlike anything she had ever seen. Vast grasslands stretched in every direction, dotted with grazing cattle and wild horses. In the distance, snow-capped mountains rose against a sky so blue it seemed impossible. Catherine pressed her face to the window, hardly able to believe this would be her new home. It was beautiful beyond anything Samuel's letters had conveyed, but also intimidatingly vast and wild. She thought of her small life in Boston, bounded by familiar streets and predictable routines, and marveled at how far she had traveled, not just in miles, but in courage. The train began to slow, and she could see buildings ahead. Millfield was larger than she had expected, with a main street lined with wooden storefronts, several churches, and what appeared to be a small hotel. Cattle pens stretched along the railroad tracks, filled with livestock waiting for transport east. The air that drifted through the window was crisp and clean, carrying scents of pine and sage. Catherine gathered her belongings, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation. In just minutes, she would step off this train and into her new life. Samuel would be waiting for her, probably holding flowers or some other token of welcome. They would ride together to his ranch, where she would see the house he had built for them, meet the neighbors who would become her community, begin the process of becoming the woman she had always dreamed of being. The train shuddered to a complete stop, and the conductor opened the doors. Catherine descended onto the wooden platform, looking around eagerly for Samuel's familiar face. She had studied the daguerreotype he had sent, memorizing his features. Strong jaw, kind eyes, dark hair with premature silver at the temples. But as she scanned the small crowd of people waiting to greet the train, she didn't see him. Perhaps he was delayed, she thought. Ranch work was unpredictable, and he might have been called away on urgent business. She would wait. A young man in a dusty coat approached her. "Excuse me, miss. Are you Miss Catherine Walsh?" "Yes," she replied, hope rising. Perhaps Samuel had sent someone to fetch her. The young man removed his hat, his expression somber. "I'm Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley. I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share with you." Catherine's heart began to race, but not with the excitement she had felt moments before. Something was wrong, very wrong. "What kind of news?" "Perhaps we should sit down," the deputy suggested, gesturing toward a bench near the station office. "No," Catherine said firmly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Whatever you have to tell me, I can hear it standing up." Deputy Bradley looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Miss Walsh, I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but Samuel Harrison died 3 days ago." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. For a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she had just heard. Samuel was dead? It was impossible. She had received a letter from him just 3 weeks ago. He had been healthy, happy, looking forward to her arrival. "How?" she managed to whisper. "Accident on the ranch," Bradley replied. "His horse spooked during a storm, threw him. He hit his head on a rock. Doc says he died instantly." Catherine stared at the young man, trying to make sense of his words. 3 days ago, while she was on the train, dreaming of her new life, Samuel had been dying. The man she had traveled 2,000 miles to marry, the man who had promised her partnership and adventure and love, was gone. "I'm truly sorry, miss," Bradley continued. "If we'd known how to reach you, we would have sent word. But your letter said you were already traveling." Catherine nodded numbly. She looked around the train platform at the dusty frontier town that was supposed to be her new home, at the mountains that were supposed to frame her new life. Everything looked exactly as she had imagined, but it was all wrong now, empty, meaningless. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, more to herself than to the deputy. "Well," Bradley said carefully, "I suppose you'll want to head back east on the next train. There's one tomorrow morning. Back east to what?" "The boarding house room. that was already rented to someone else, the teaching position that had been filled, the life she had deliberately left behind because it offered no future worth having. "I don't have anywhere to go back to," Catherine said quietly, the full reality of her situation beginning to sink in. She was stranded in a strange place, 2,000 miles from everything familiar, with limited funds and no prospects. The life she had left behind was gone, and the life she had come to claim had died with Samuel Harrison. Deputy Bradley looked even more uncomfortable. "There's a hotel in town," he offered. "Mrs. Cooper runs a decent place. Maybe you could stay there while you figure things out." Catherine nodded, though she had no idea what there was to figure out. Her carefully planned future had vanished in an instant, leaving her adrift in a world she didn't understand, with no clear path forward. Did Samuel leave any family?" she asked. "No, miss. His wife died in childbirth 5 years ago, and the baby with her. He had no other relatives that anyone knew of. The ranch will probably go to the bank, I expect, so even that was gone. The home Samuel had built for them, the place where she was supposed to start her new life, would be sold to strangers." Catherine felt as though she were falling through space, with nothing to catch her. "I'll help you get your trunk to the hotel," Bradley offered, and Catherine realized she was still standing on the platform, holding her small valise, while her entire world crumbled around her. She followed him in a daze, her feet moving automatically, while her mind struggled to accept this new reality. The hotel was a modest 2-story building with a sign that read, "Cooper House, clean rooms, fair rates." Mrs. Cooper, a plump woman with kind eyes and greying hair, took one look at Catherine's face and seemed to understand immediately that something was terribly wrong. "You must be the young lady who came to marry Sam Harrison," she said gently. "Deputy Bradley told me about the accident. I'm so very sorry, dear." Catherine managed to thank her and accept the offered room, though everything felt like it was happening to someone else. She climbed the stairs to a small but clean room with a single window overlooking the main street of Millfield. When Mrs. Cooper left her alone, Catherine sat on the narrow bed and tried to understand what had just happened to her life. She had risked everything on the promise of love and partnership with a man she had never met. She had burned her bridges in Boston, sold her possessions, spent her savings on this journey. And now Samuel was dead, and she was stranded in a place where she knew no one, with no way to rebuild what she had left behind. For the first time since receiving the devastating news, Catherine allowed herself to cry. She wept for Samuel Harrison, the man she had never met but had come to love through his letters. She wept for the future they would never share, the life they would never build together. And she wept for herself, for the desperate leap of faith that had brought her so far only to leave her more alone than she had ever been. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine Elizabeth Walsh faced the ruins of her carefully planned future and wondered if she would ever find the courage to rebuild her life from the ashes of her shattered dreams. Catherine woke to the sound of shouting in the street below, the unfamiliar noises of frontier life, cattle lowing, wagon wheels on dirt, men calling to each other in rough voices, pulled her from the fitful sleep she had finally found near dawn. For a moment she forgot where she was, expecting to see the familiar walls of her Boston boarding house room. Instead, harsh morning sunlight streamed through unfamiliar curtains onto rough wooden walls. Then memory crashed back like a cold wave. Samuel was dead. She was alone in Montana territory, with nowhere to go and dwindling funds. The life she had traveled so far to claim had vanished before she could even touch it. A knock at the door interrupted her despair. "Miss Walsh," came Mrs. Cooper's voice. "I've brought you some breakfast. May I come in?" Catherine quickly smoothed her hair and opened the door. Mrs. Cooper entered carrying a tray with coffee, biscuits, and what appeared to be eggs and bacon. The kindness in the older woman's eyes made Catherine's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I thought you might not feel up to coming down to the dining room this morning," Mrs. Cooper said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "How are you feeling, dear?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Lost," Catherine answered honestly, surprising herself with her candor. "I'm afraid I don't know what to do next." Mrs. Cooper nodded sympathetically. "It's a terrible shock, what happened to Sam. He was a good man, well respected in the community. Everyone's grieving his loss." Catherine accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth helping to chase away some of the numbness that had settled over her. Deputy Bradley mentioned that his ranch would go to the bank. Did Samuel have debts? Mrs. Cooper's expression grew troubled. "Well, that's where things get complicated. You see, there are several parties claiming interest in Sam's property. The Territorial Bank holds the mortgage, true enough, but there are others who say they have claims too." "What kind of claims?" Marcus Kellner, he owns the biggest ranch in the valley, says Sam owed him money for cattle. Jake Morrison at the general store has invoices Sam never paid. And then there's... Mrs. Cooper hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "Please," Catherine said, "I need to understand what's happening." "Well, there's Ezra Whitman. He runs the other hotel in town and several other businesses. He's been buying up properties around here for months. Says he's representing investors back east who want to develop the territory. He's been after Sam's land for a while now, offering to buy him out." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "And now that Samuel is dead? Now Whitman's saying the property should go to auction to settle the debts. He's got the territorial judge's ear, and money talks loudly in these parts." Mrs. Cooper's voice carried a note of disapproval. "Sam was struggling some, it's true. Last winter was hard, and he lost cattle to the cold. But he was an honest man, and he was working to make things right." Catherine set down her coffee cup, her mind racing. Samuel's letters had never mentioned financial difficulties. He had painted a picture of a successful, thriving ranch. Had he been protecting her from the truth, or had circumstances changed dramatically in recent months? "Mrs. Cooper, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Was Samuel really planning to marry me? Did he tell anyone in town about my coming?" The older woman's face softened. "Oh, my dear, yes. He was so excited about your arrival. He came into town just last week to pick up supplies for fixing up the ranch house. Said he wanted everything perfect for his bride. He showed me the daguerreotype you sent. Proud as anything he was." Relief flooded through Catherine. At least that much had been real. Samuel had genuinely wanted to marry her, had been preparing for her arrival. It made his death feel even more tragic, but it also validated the feelings she had developed through their correspondence. "What about his accident?" Catherine asked. "Deputy Bradley said his horse threw him during a storm." Mrs. Cooper's expression grew more guarded. "That's what they say. Found him the morning after that big thunderstorm 3 nights ago near the creek that runs through his property. Doc Peters said it looked like his head hit a rock when he fell." Something in Mrs. Cooper's tone suggested there was more to the story. "But you have doubts?" "It's not my place to question the authorities," Mrs. Cooper said carefully. "But Sam was one of the best horsemen in the territory. Been riding since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Hard to imagine any horse getting the better of him, storm or no storm." Before Catherine could ask more questions, the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs interrupted them. Mrs. Cooper's face tightened with displeasure as a sharp knock sounded at the door. "Miss Walsh," a man's voice called, "I'd like a word with you, if you please." Mrs. Cooper opened the door to reveal a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s with silver hair and calculating eyes. Behind him stood 2 other men, one heavy-set with a badge pinned to his vest, the other lean and dangerous-looking with a gun prominently displayed at his hip. "I'm Ezra Whitman," the silver-haired man said, stepping into the room without invitation. This is Sheriff Daniels and my associate, Mr. Cross. I understand you came here expecting to marry Sam Harrison." Catherine stood, instinctively straightening her shoulders despite feeling intimidated by the men's sudden presence. "Yes, I did. And you are?" "As I said, I'm Ezra Whitman. I own several businesses in Millfield and the surrounding area. I'm also the executor of Sam Harrison's estate." "I wasn't aware Samuel had appointed an executor," Catherine said carefully. Whitman smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Miss Walsh, when a man dies intestate, that is without a will, the territorial court appoints someone to handle his affairs. Given my business experience and standing in the community, Judge Morrison saw fit to give me that responsibility." Mrs. Cooper made a small noise of displeasure, quickly covered by clearing her throat. Catherine noticed the exchange and filed it away for later consideration. "I see," Catherine said. "And what does this have to do with me?" "I understand you may have developed certain expectations regarding Sam's property," Whitman continued smoothly. "I wanted to clarify the legal situation before any misunderstandings arose. You see, without a legal marriage having taken place, you have no claim whatsoever to Sam's estate." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm aware of that, Mr. Whitman. I never presumed otherwise." Good, good. Now, I also understand that your journey here represents a considerable financial investment on your part. Train fare from Boston, hotel expenses, lost wages from leaving your employment. It's unfortunate that circumstances have left you stranded here." The way he said it made Catherine's skin crawl. There was something predatory in his manner, as if he were circling wounded prey. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "Of course," Whitman agreed, "but I'd like to make you an offer that might help. With your situation," Catherine waited, saying nothing, "I'm prepared to pay your return fare to Boston, plus a sum for your inconvenience. Let's say $500 total. More than generous, I think you'll agree. All I ask in return is that you sign a simple document acknowledging that you have no claim to Sam Harrison's property or possessions." The amount was more money than Catherine had ever seen at once, enough to start over anywhere she chose. But something about Whitman's eagerness to get rid of her made her deeply suspicious. "That's very generous," she said slowly, "but I need time to consider my options." Whitman's smile became strained. "Miss Walsh, I hope you understand that Millfield isn't the kind of place where a single woman can simply settle. This is rough country, full of dangers you can't imagine. A lady of your obvious refinement would be much happier returning to civilization." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sheriff Daniels shifted his weight, the movement causing his gun belt to creak ominously. The lean man called Cross never took his eyes off Catherine, his stare making her feel like a mouse being watched by a snake. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare," Catherine replied, keeping her voice level. "But as I said, I need time to think." "How much time?" Whitman asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. "A few days, at least." Whitman exchanged a glance with Sheriff Daniels before turning back to Catherine. "Very well, but Miss Walsh, I should warn you that if you choose to remain in Millfield, you'll find it a lonely and unwelcoming place. Good day." The three men left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving Catherine and Mrs. Cooper alone in the suddenly quiet room. Catherine sank into her chair, her legs suddenly weak with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Well," Mrs. Cooper said, grimly, "that certainly didn't take long." "What do you mean?" "Whitman moving to secure his interests. I'm surprised he waited until today to approach you." Catherine looked at the older woman with a growing alarm. "Mrs. Cooper, what exactly is going on here? Why is Mr. Whitman so eager to get rid of me?" Mrs. Cooper closed the door and lowered her voice. "Because Sam's ranch sits on some of the best land in the territory. Water rights, good grazing, and She hesitated. And what? There are rumors about a railroad coming through. If it's true, land values will skyrocket. Sam's property would be worth 10 times what it is now. Catherine felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. And Mr. Whitman wants to acquire it before that happens. For a fraction of its real value, yes. He's been pressuring landowners all over the valley to sell. Most have held out so far, but if Sam's property goes to auction, he could buy it for the amount of the outstanding debts, Catherine finished. But why is he so concerned about me? I already told him I have no legal claim. Mrs. Cooper gave her a long, measuring look. Maybe because you're the only person who's seen Sam's private papers, his letters to you, for instance. What if there was something in them that contradicted the story about his debts? Catherine's mind raced back through Samuel's correspondence. He had mentioned challenges, harsh winters, cattle losses, but nothing that suggested overwhelming a debt. In fact, his most recent letters had been optimistic about the ranch's prospects. Mrs. Cooper, who found Samuel's body. Jake Morrison and his son. They were checking their own cattle when they spotted Sam's horse wandering loose, followed it back and found Sam by the creek. And the horse? Uninjured. Seemed calm enough when they caught it. Catherine filed away. This information, her teacher's mind automatically organizing details and looking for patterns. Something wasn't right about Samuel's death, and Whitman's eagerness to buy her silence only strengthened her suspicions. A commotion in the street below drew their attention to the window. A wagon was pulling up in front of the hotel, driven by a man Catherine didn't recognize. But it wasn't the driver who caught her attention. It was the woman sitting beside him. She was clearly of Native American heritage, with long black hair, braided with beads, and dressed in a mixture of traditional and frontier clothing. Her bearing was proud and dignified, despite the hostile stares she was receiving from some of the townspeople gathered on the wooden sidewalks. "Who is that?" Catherine asked. Mrs. Cooper's expression grew troubled. "That's Mary Crow Feather. She's a healer, lives about 10 miles north of here with her nephew. She was the one who prepared Sam's body for burial." Something in Mrs. Cooper's tone suggested there was more to the story. "What is it you're not telling me?" "Mary came to me yesterday after the funeral. She was troubled about something she saw when she was washing Sam's body. Said there were marks that didn't look like they came from a fall." Catherine's blood ran cold. "What kind of marks?" She wouldn't say exactly, just that something wasn't right. But Mary's seen plenty of accident victims in her time. If she says something was wrong... Before Catherine could respond, the hotel door opened, and Mrs. Cooper's husband appeared at the top of the stairs. "Helen," he called urgently, "Mary Crow Feather is asking to speak with the lady from Boston. Should I send her up?" Catherine and Mrs. Cooper exchanged glances. Catherine's heart was pounding, but she knew she needed to hear what the healer had to say. "Yes," Catherine called down. "Please ask her to come up." Mary Crow Feather climbed the stairs with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving quietly through the world. She was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. When she entered the room, she studied Catherine with an intensity that was both disconcerting and oddly comforting. "You are the woman Samuel Harrison was to marry," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I'm Catherine Walsh." Mary nodded and sat in the chair Mrs. Cooper offered. "I prepared Samuel's body for the earth. It is work I have done many times. I know what a man looks like when he dies from falling, when he dies from sickness, when he dies from violence." Catherine felt her mouth go dry. "And Samuel. Harrison did not die from falling off his horse." Mary's voice was quiet but certain. "There were marks on his body, bruises on his ribs, his arms, old marks, maybe a week old, and his head wound." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "The rock that supposedly killed him had no blood on it. But there was blood. On a fence post 20 feet away." Catherine sank into her chair, the implications crashing over her. "You're saying he was murdered?" "I am saying someone hurt Samuel Harrison before the night he died, and that his death did not happen the way the sheriff says it did." Mrs. Cooper had gone pale. "Mary, if you're right, this is dangerous talk. Ezra Whitman has a lot of influence in this territory." Mary's eyes flashed. "Ezra Whitman has been stealing land from my people for years, using threats and violence when money doesn't work. Now he turns his attention to white settlers who won't sell to him." Catherine felt a chill of recognition. "He was here this morning offering to pay my way back to Boston if I'd signed papers saying I have no claim to Samuel's property." "Of course he was," Mary said grimly. "Because you represent a threat to his plans. A grieving fiancé asking questions about her beloved's death might draw unwanted attention from territorial authorities." "But I have no legal standing," Catherine protested. "I can't inherit the ranch or contest its sale." Mary studied her for a long moment. "Perhaps not. But you have something Whitman fears even more than legal claims." "What's that?" "The truth, and the will to seek justice for a good man's murder." The room fell silent as the weight of Mary's words settled over them. Catherine realized that she stood at another crossroads, perhaps more dangerous than the one that had brought her west. She could take Whitman's money and flee back to the safety of the East, leaving Samuel's death unavenged and his property in the hands of the men who had killed him. Or she could stay and fight for the truth, knowing that doing so would put her in grave danger. "Mrs. Cooper," Catherine said finally, "how much would it cost to stay in this hotel for a week?" "Catherine, dear, you can't be thinking of—" "How much?" Mrs. Cooper sighed. $7. But honey, if you're planning to go up against Ezra Whitman, you need to know what you're facing. He owns the sheriff, half the businesses in town, and he's got men who'll do anything he tells them to do." Catherine looked out the window at the harsh, beautiful landscape that was supposed to have been her new home. Samuel Harrison had died trying to build something honest and lasting in this place. The least she could do was ensure his death wasn't in vain. "Then I suppose I'll need allies," she said quietly. Mary Crowfeather smiled for the first time since entering the room. "In that case, Miss Walsh, you should know that my nephew will be arriving in town this afternoon. His name is Daniel Crowfeather, and he knew Samuel Harrison well, very well indeed." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mary said, standing to leave, "that Samuel Harrison saved my nephew's life 2 years ago, and Daniel has been looking for a way to repay that debt ever since. Learning that Samuel was murdered might be just the opportunity he's been waiting for." After Mary left, Catherine stood at the window watching the activity in the street below. Millfield looked like any other frontier town. Dusty, rough-hewn, honest in its simplicity, but she was beginning to understand that beneath its ordinary surface lay currents of greed, corruption, and violence that could destroy anyone who threatened the wrong people's interests. She thought of Samuel's letters, filled with hope and plans for their future together. He had died before they could meet, but perhaps she could still honor the partnership he had offered her, not as his wife, but as someone determined to ensure that his death would not be forgotten or his killers allowed to profit from their crime. For the first time since learning of Samuel's death, Catherine felt something other than grief and despair. She felt purpose, and as dangerous as it might be, purpose was something she could hold on to in a world that had suddenly become utterly unpredictable. The afternoon stretched ahead of her, full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. But one thing was certain. Catherine Elizabeth Walsh was no longer the same woman who had stepped off the train yesterday morning. That woman had been seeking a new life. This woman was seeking justice, and she was about to discover that sometimes the two were the same thing. The rider appeared on the horizon just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Catherine watched from her hotel window as he approached Millfield, noting the fluid way he sat his horse and the respectful distance other travellers gave him on the dusty main road. Even from a distance, she could see he was Native American, and she suspected this must be Daniel Crowfeather, the nephew Mary had mentioned. As he drew closer, Catherine could make out more details. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with long black hair tied back and clothes that blended frontier practicality with traditional elements. Buckskin vest over a white cotton shirt, dark trousers, and boots worn, smooth by long use. He rode a magnificent paint horse, its coat a striking pattern of white and chestnut that caught the light as they moved. What struck Catherine most, however, was the way the townspeople reacted to his arrival. Conversations stopped. People stepped back from the street. Children were quickly ushered indoors. The atmosphere grew tense in a way that made Catherine's stomach clench with unease. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her observations. "Miss Walsh," Mrs. Cooper's voice carried a note of urgency. "You have a visitor downstairs. Says his name is Daniel Crowfeather." Catherine's pulse quickened. "I'll be right down." She descended to the hotel's small lobby to find Daniel Crowfeather standing near the window, his dark eyes scanning the street outside with the wariness of someone accustomed to watching for danger. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders and the lean build of a man who spent his life outdoors. His face was striking, high cheekbones, strong jaw, and those dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. When he turned to look at her, Catherine felt an unexpected jolt of something, recognition, attraction. Whatever it was, she pushed it aside immediately. She was here to seek justice for Samuel, not to complicate her already precarious situation. "Miss Walsh," he said, his voice deep and quiet. "I'm Daniel Crowfeather. My Aunt Mary said you wanted to speak with me about Samuel Harrison." "Yes," Catherine replied, suddenly aware that several townspeople were peering through the hotel windows at them. "Perhaps we should talk somewhere more private." Daniel glanced around the lobby, noting the same unwanted attention. "There's a place outside town where we can speak freely. Are you willing to ride?" Catherine hesitated. She had ridden as a child, but hadn't been on a horse in years. More concerning was the impropriety of riding alone with a man she had just met. But then she remembered Mary's words about seeking justice and her own determination to uncover the truth about Samuel's death. "Yes," she said. "Give me a moment to change into something more suitable." 20 minutes later, Catherine emerged from the hotel wearing the most practical dress she owned and a pair of boots Mrs. Cooper had lent her. Daniel waited with 2 horses, his paint, and a gentle-looking mare with kind eyes. "This is Luna," he said, introducing the mare. "She belonged to Samuel. Mary thought you should have her." Catherine's throat tightened with emotion. Samuel's horse. She approached Luna carefully, letting the mare sniff her hand before stroking her neck. "She's beautiful." Samuel thought so too. He said she was the smartest horse he'd ever owned. Daniel helped Catherine mount, his hands steady and sure as he guided her into the saddle. "He was planning to teach you to ride." The mention of Samuel's plans sent a pang through Catherine's heart, but she pushed the grief aside. There would be time for mourning later. Now, she needed answers. They rode out of town in silence, Daniel leading them along a path that wound through rolling grassland toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near a creek. Catherine was surprised by how quickly she remembered the rhythm of riding, and Luna seemed to sense her inexperience, moving with extra care and responding to the slightest touch on the reins. When they reached the grove of trees, Daniel dismounted and helped Catherine down. The spot was beautiful and secluded, with the creek providing a gentle soundtrack and the trees offering welcome shade. It was also, Catherine realized, completely hidden from view of anyone who might be watching from town. "Your Aunt Mary believes Samuel was murdered, Catherine said without preamble, once they were seated on a fallen log near the water. Daniel nodded grimly. Mary is rarely wrong about such things. She's seen too much death to mistake the signs. She said you knew Samuel well. He saved my life, Daniel said simply. 2 years ago I was tracking stolen horses that belonged to a friend of my aunt's. The thieves led me into an ambush in Devil's Canyon. Samuel found me 3 days later, more dead than alive. He nursed me back to health, never asked questions about why I was there or whether I might be the one who stole the horses. Catherine studied his profile as he spoke. There was a hardness to him, an edge that suggested he had seen violence and wasn't afraid of it. But there was also something else, a core of honor that reminded her of the integrity she had sensed. In Samuel's letters, Mary said, you've been looking for a way to repay him. A debt of life is the most sacred debt among my people, Daniel replied. I had hoped to repay it while Samuel was alive. Now, he turned to look at her directly. Now I can only ensure his death is avenged. The intensity in his dark eyes made Catherine's breath catch. This was a dangerous man, she realized. Dangerous to his enemies, at least. But something about his presence made her feel safer than she had since arriving in Millfield. Tell me about Ezra Whitman, she said. Daniel's expression darkened. Whitman is poison in human form. He came to Montana Territory 5 years ago, claiming to represent Eastern investors interested in development. What he really represents is greed and corruption. Mrs. Cooper mentioned he's been pressuring landowners to sell. Now, pressuring is a gentle word for what Whitman does, Daniel said. He starts with offers that seem generous. When those are refused, he finds ways to create financial pressure, calling in debts, influencing banks, arranging for accidents that destroy crops or kill livestock. If that doesn't work, he uses violence. My aunt's people have lost 3 good men to accidents since Whitman arrived. Falls from cliffs, drowning in shallow creeks, trampling by normally gentle horses. Always when they were alone, always with no witnesses. Catherine felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air. And the authorities do nothing? Daniel's laugh was bitter. Sheriff Daniels owes his position to Whitman's influence, Judge Morrison's. Zun works for one of Whitman's businesses. The territorial governor is rumored to be a silent partner in Whitman's land development scheme. So there's no legal recourse. Not through official channels, no. Catherine was quiet for a moment, digesting this information. The situation was even worse than she had imagined. If Daniel was right, Samuel's murder was just one in a series of killings designed to clear the way for Whitman's scheme. Why is Samuel's land so important, she asked. Daniel stood and walked to the edge of the creek, picking up a smooth stone and skipping it across the water. Several reasons. The water rights, for one. It's some of the best grazing land in the territory. But the real prize is what Whitman doesn't want anyone else to know about. Which is? The railroad survey team was through here 6 months ago. They were quiet about it, but my aunt's people noticed them. They were mapping a route that would run right through Samuel's property. Catherine's mind raced. So, if Whitman can acquire the land cheaply now, he can sell it to the railroad for 10 times what he paid, or develop it himself when the railroad brings prosperity to the region. Daniel skipped another stone, this one making 7 hops before disappearing beneath the surface. Samuel knew about the railroad. He refused Whitman's offers because he understood what his land would be worth. So Whitman had him killed. Almost. Certainly. But proving it? Daniel shook his head. Whitman is too clever to do his own dirty work. He has men like Cross who handle the violence, and he makes sure there are always alibis and explanations that satisfy corrupt officials. Catherine stood and joined him by the water's edge. What if we could find proof? Real evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Daniel turned to study her face. That would be extremely dangerous. Whitman has already marked you as a threat simply because of your connection to Samuel. If you start actively investigating, he'll Try to have me killed too, Catherine finished. I understand that. Do you? Daniel's voice was sharp. This isn't Boston society, Miss Walsh. Out here, people disappear and are never found. They have accidents that leave no witnesses. Whitman has killed at least half a dozen people that I know of, and he sleeps peacefully every night because he knows no one can touch him. Catherine met his gaze steadily. Then perhaps it's time someone tried. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. You're serious about this? Samuel was going to be my husband. He was planning a life for us, building something good and honest in this place. Whitman took that away from him, from me, from everyone who cared about him. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I may not have legal standing as Samuel's wife, but I have something else. What's that? Nothing left to lose. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those dark, penetrating eyes. Finally, he nodded slowly. Mary was right about you. What did she say? That you have the spirit of a warrior beneath the clothes of a lady. He smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. I think Samuel would have been very happy with his choice of bride. The compliment sent an unexpected warmth through Catherine, followed immediately by guilt. She had no business feeling attracted to another man so soon after Samuel's death. But there was something about Daniel Crowfeather that called to her in a way she had never experienced, not even through Samuel's letters. If we're going to seek justice for Samuel, she said, forcing herself to focus on practical matters, we need to understand exactly what we're up against. Daniel nodded and returned to their makeshift seats by the fallen log. Whitman has three main advantages: money, political connections, and violence. He owns or controls most of the legitimate businesses in Millfield, which gives him economic leverage over anyone who depends on the town for their livelihood. Like Mrs. Cooper. Exactly. Cross her, and suddenly her supply deliveries are delayed. Her credit is called in, her building permits are denied. Whitman doesn't need to threaten people directly. He can strangle them economically. What about his political connections? Sheriff Daniels is completely in his pocket. Judge Morrison is more cautious, but his son's job with Whitman's freight company ensures his cooperation. The territorial governor, Daniel shrugged, hard to prove, but convenient decisions always seem to go Whitman's way. Catherine absorbed this information, her teacher's mind automatically organizing it into categories and connections. And the violence. That's where Cross comes in. Jack Cross is a gunfighter Whitman brought in from Colorado. Fast, ruthless, and completely without conscience. He has 2 or 3 men working for him. Drifters, mostly, the kind who'll do anything for money and don't ask questions. How do we fight someone like that? Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant, carefully, and with advantages he doesn't expect us to have, such as knowledge of the territory. My aunt's people know every trail, every hiding place, every water source for 100 miles. Whitman's men are good at intimidating townspeople, but they're not woodsmen. Catherine felt a flicker of hope. What else? Moral authority. Most people in Millfield know Whitman is corrupt, but they're too afraid or dependent on him to speak out. If we can give them a reason to believe he can be defeated, they might find their courage. Some of them, anyway. Daniel turned to look at her directly. But Miss Walsh, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we really try, to bring down Whitman, there's no going back. He won't let us simply change our minds and walk away. Catherine thought of the life she had left behind in Boston, the safe, predictable existence she had abandoned for the promise of something better. That world seemed impossibly distant now, separated from her current reality by more than just miles. I told Mrs. Cooper this morning that I had nothing left to lose, she said quietly. That's not entirely true. I could still take Whitman's money, and flee back east. But if I do that, Samuel's death becomes meaningless, his killers go free, and other good people like him will die. And if you stay? Catherine met his gaze steadily. If I stay, at least Samuel's death will be avenged. And maybe, just maybe, we can stop Whitman from destroying anyone else. Daniel studied her for a long moment, and Catherine had the sense that he was measuring her in some way, testing her resolve. Finally, he nodded. All right, Miss Walsh. If you're determined to see this through, then we're partners. The word partners sent an unexpected thrill through Catherine. Samuel had promised her partnership in his letters, but this was different. This was a partnership forged in shared purpose and mutual respect, born out of danger and necessity. "What's our first step?" she asked. "We need to examine Samuel's body." Catherine's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" "Mary prepared him for burial, but she couldn't examine him thoroughly without raising suspicions. If we're going to prove he was murdered, we need to document his injuries properly." The thought of disturbing Samuel's grave was horrible, but Catherine forced herself to think logically. When? Tonight. The cemetery is outside town, and there's no moon. We'll have a cover of darkness. Catherine nodded, though the prospect terrified her. What about after that? We search his ranch for evidence. If Whitman's men killed him, they might have left traces. And there's something else. Samuel was keeping records of Whitman's attempts to pressure him. If we can find those records, we'd have proof of a motive. Exactly. They spent the next hour planning their nighttime activities. Daniel would meet her behind the hotel at midnight with horses and tools for opening Samuel's grave. They would examine the body by lantern light, then ride to Samuel's ranch to search for evidence before dawn. As the sun began to set, they prepared to return to town. Daniel helped Catherine mount Luna again, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary on her waist. The contact sent a jolt of awareness through her that she tried to ignore. "Miss Walsh," he said, looking up at her, "before we do this, I need to ask you something." "What? Are you certain you're prepared for what we might find? Examining a murder victim. It's not something most ladies are equipped to handle." Catherine thought of the wounded soldiers she had nursed during the war, of the death and suffering she had witnessed in Boston's charity hospitals. "I've seen death before, Mr. Crowfeather. I won't faint or become hysterical, if that's what you're worried about." "That's not what concerns me," Daniel said quietly. "What concerns me is that once you see what they did to Samuel, once you understand the full extent of Whitman's brutality, there'll be no part of you that wants to show mercy when we finally face him." The intensity in his voice made Catherine shiver. This was another glimpse of the dangerous man beneath Daniel's controlled exterior, and she realized that he was offering her one last chance to turn back before crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Mr. Crowfeather," she said firmly, "I didn't come this far to show mercy to murderers." Something flickered in his dark eyes, approval perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Good," he said simply, "because neither did I." As they rode back toward Millfield, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Catherine felt a strange sense of completion. She had come west seeking a new life as Samuel Harrison's wife. Instead, she had found purpose as Daniel, Crowfeather's partner in justice. It wasn't the life she had planned, but as Luna's steady gait carried her toward whatever dangers the night might hold, Catherine realized it might be exactly the life she was meant to live. The town of Millfield lay ahead of them, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight as darkness approached. Somewhere in those buildings, Ezra Whitman was probably planning his next move, confident that a frightened Eastern lady would soon accept his generous offer and disappear from his life forever. He was about to discover just how wrong he could be. The midnight air carried a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn temperature. Catherine stood at her hotel room window, watching the street below for any sign of movement. Millfield appeared deserted, its windows dark and its boardwalks empty, but she knew that appearances could be deceiving. Somewhere in the shadows, Whitman's men might be watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. A soft whistle from the alley behind the hotel signaled Daniel's arrival. Catherine gathered the dark cloak Mrs. Cooper had lent her and made her way quietly down the back stairs, careful to avoid the creaky third step that would alert anyone to her movement. Daniel waited with 2 horses already saddled, their hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle their footsteps. He had changed into all-black clothing and moved with the silent grace of someone accustomed to moving unseen through dangerous territory. "Ready?" he whispered. Catherine nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety about what they were about to do. Disturbing Samuel's grave felt like a violation, but she forced herself to remember Mary's words about the inconsistencies in his injuries. If they were going to prove murder, they needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed. They rode through the darkness in complete silence, following a route Daniel had carefully planned to avoid the main roads. The cemetery lay on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by a low stone wall and dotted with simple wooden crosses and headstones. Most of the graves were recent, marking the final resting places of those who had sought their fortunes in the frontier and found only death. Samuel's grave was easy to locate. It was the freshest, the earth still dark and loose over the wooden coffin below. A simple wooden cross bore his name and the dates of his birth and death, the carving rough but readable in the dim starlight. Daniel unpacked his tools while Catherine stood watch, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign they had been followed. The night sounds of the frontier, owls calling, distant coyotes, the rustle of small animals through the grass, seemed amplified in the cemetery's stillness. "This is going to be difficult," Daniel warned quietly as he began to dig. "Are you certain you can handle it?" "I have to," Catherine replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "For Samuel." The digging took nearly an hour. Daniel worked steadily but carefully, trying to disturb the grave as little as possible while still accessing the coffin below. When his shovel finally struck wood, Catherine felt her courage waver for a moment. This was really happening. They were about to look upon the face of the man she had traveled so far to marry. Daniel used a crowbar to carefully pry open the coffin lid, revealing Samuel Harrison's body in the flickering light of their shielded lantern. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Even in death she could see the kindness in his face that had shone through in his letters. He had been a handsome man, with strong features and prematurely grey hair that gave him a distinguished appearance. But as Mary had warned them, there were signs that his death had not been peaceful. Even Catherine's untrained eye could see the bruising on his arms and ribs, dark marks that spoke of violence inflicted days before his death. Daniel examined the body with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had seen too much violence. He photographed the injuries with a small camera he had brought, carefully documenting each bruise and wound. "Mary was right," he said grimly. "These injuries are several days old. Someone beat him badly before the night he died." Catherine forced herself to look closely at the evidence, her teacher's mind cataloguing details, even as her heart ached for the pain Samuel must have endured. "What about the head wound?" Daniel examined the fatal injury carefully. "This is interesting. The wound is on the back of his head, but it's not consistent with hitting a rock while falling forward off a horse." "What do you mean?" "The shape and depth suggest he was struck with something heavy and blunt, a club or the butt of a rifle perhaps. And see these marks around the edges? They look like metal-left impressions in the bone." Catherine's stomach churned, but she forced herself to remain steady. "So he was beaten, then killed with a deliberate blow to the head. That's what the evidence suggests. The question is why they waited several days between the beating and the killing. Maybe they were trying to persuade him to sell, Catherine suggested. When he refused, they decided to kill him and make it look like an accident. Daniel nodded grimly. That would fit Whitman's pattern. He prefers to get what he wants through intimidation, but he's not afraid to escalate to murder when necessary. They spent another 20 minutes documenting everything they could see, taking notes and photographs that would serve as evidence of the true cause of Samuel's death. When they were finished, Daniel carefully closed the coffin and began the somber task of refilling the grave. "I'm sorry, Samuel," Catherine whispered, as the earth covered his coffin once more. "But I promise you, your death will not go unavenged." As dawn approached, they rode towards Samuel's ranch, following creek beds and game trails to avoid being seen. The property sat in a beautiful valley surrounded by rolling hills, with a modest but well-built ranch house overlooking a stream that wound through rich grassland. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, Catherine could see why Samuel had loved this place. It was exactly as he had described in his letters. A piece of paradise carved out of the wilderness, perfect for raising horses and building a life. But as they drew closer to the house, Daniel held up a hand for her to stop. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. Catherine strained her eyes in the darkness, trying to see what had alerted him. Then she noticed it too, a faint glow coming from one of the ranch house windows. "Someone's inside," she whispered. Daniel nodded, his hand moving, instinctively to the rifle secured to his saddle. "Wait here with the horses. I'm going to get closer and see who it is." "I'm coming with you, Miss Walsh." "Catherine," she corrected firmly, "and I'm not staying behind. If someone is ransacking Samuel's house, I want to see who it is." Daniel studied her face in the dim light, then nodded reluctantly. "Stay low and stay quiet. If I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" They left the horses tied to a grove of cottonwood trees and approached the house on foot, using the barn and outbuildings for cover. As they got closer, they could hear voices coming from inside the house. At least 2 men, possibly 3. Daniel led Catherine to a position beneath one of the side windows, where they could peer inside without being seen. What they saw made Catherine's blood run cold. 3 men were systematically destroying the interior of Samuel's house. They had torn apart furniture, emptied drawers onto the floor, and ripped paintings from the walls. One of them, a lean man, with a scar across his cheek, was using a knife to slice open the cushions of Samuel's favorite chair. "That's Jack Cross," Daniel whispered, his voice tight with anger. "Whitman's enforcer." Catherine watched in horror as the men continued their destructive search. They were looking for something specific, tearing apart everything Samuel had built with a casual brutality that spoke of complete disregard for human dignity. "What are they searching for?" she whispered. "Documents, most likely. Anything that might implicate Whitman in Samuel's murder or prove the railroad connection." As they watched, Cross found something that made him call out to his companions. He had discovered a loose floorboard near the fireplace and was prying it up with his knife. From the hiding place beneath, he pulled out a metal strongbox. "That's it," he said in a gravelly voice that carried clearly through the window. "This is what the boss wanted us to find." One of the other men, a heavy-set fellow with a thick beard, looked skeptical. "How do you know that's what he's after?" Cross smiled coldly. "Because Harrison was keeping records of every conversation he had with Whitman, every threat, every attempt to force him off his land. Smart man, our late rancher. Too bad for him, not smart enough." Catherine felt a surge of admiration for Samuel's foresight, followed immediately by despair as she watched their crucial evidence disappear into Cross's coat pocket. "We need to get that strongbox," she whispered to Daniel. 3 armed men against the 2 of us? That's not good odds. Then we'll have to even them somehow." Daniel looked at her with something approaching admiration. "You're really not going?" To back down from this, are you? Would you? He smiled grimly. No, I wouldn't. He studied the situation for a moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities. There's a way, but it's risky. Tell me. The barn has a hayloft that overlooks the front yard. If I can get up there with my rifle, I can cover you while you create a distraction. What kind of distraction? Set fire to the back of the house. When they come out to investigate, I'll have a clear shot at Cross. In the confusion, you might be able to retrieve the strongbox. Catherine's heart raced at the audacity of the plan, but she could see the logic in it. What if they don't all come out? Then we improvise. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than watching Whitman's men destroy the evidence they desperately needed. Catherine nodded her agreement, and Daniel squeezed her hand briefly before moving toward the barn. Catherine waited until she saw the glint of his rifle barrel in the hayloft window, then made her way around to the back of the house. She gathered dry grass and fallen leaves, piling them against the wooden wall near what appeared to be the kitchen. Using matches from her pocket, she set the kindling ablaze and retreated to a safe distance. The fire caught quickly, sending orange flames licking up the side of the house and filling the air with smoke. Within moments, shouts erupted from inside as the men discovered the blaze. Fire! The whole place is going up! The front door burst open and two of the men rushed out, buckets in hand, as they ran toward the stream to fetch water. But Cross remained inside, and Catherine could see him through the window, calmly continuing his search of the house, even as smoke began to fill the rooms. Daniel's rifle cracked once, and one of the men by the stream cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. The other man dove for cover behind a water trough, drawing his pistol and firing wildly toward the barn. Cross finally emerged from the house, the strongbox still tucked under his arm. But instead of joining the fight, he moved toward the horses tied behind the house, clearly intending to escape with his prize. Catherine saw her chance. As Cross reached for his horse's reins, she stepped out from behind the corner of the house, Samuel's pistol, which Daniel had given her for protection, steady in her hands. "Stop right there!" she called out. Cross spun around, his own gun appearing in his hand with practiced speed. For a moment, they faced each other across the yard, weapons drawn, each waiting for the other to make a move. "Well, well," Cross said, his scarred face twisting into an unpleasant smile. "If it isn't the grieving bride, come to pay your respects to your dead lover's property?" "I've come for justice," Catherine replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Put down the strongbox and surrender." Cross laughed harshly. "Surrender? To a Boston schoolmarm with a pistol she probably doesn't know how to use. I don't think so." He was right about one thing. Catherine had never fired a gun at another human being. But her hours of practice with Mrs. Redfeather had taught her the basics, and desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "The strongbox contains evidence of Samuel Harrison's murder," she said. "You're not leaving with it. Is that so?" Cross's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "And what makes you think you can stop me?" "Because she's not alone." Daniel's voice came from directly behind Cross, and Catherine saw the enforcer's eyes widen in surprise. Somehow, Daniel had managed to leave the barn and circle around behind him without being detected. "Drop your weapon," Daniel commanded, his rifle pressed against Cross's back. For a moment it seemed as though Cross might comply. Then, with the lightning-fast reflexes of a professional gunfighter, he spun and fired. Daniel dove sideways, the bullet passing so close that Catherine could see it tear through his shirt. His own rifle discharged as he fell, the shot going wide, but causing Cross to stumble backward. Catherine acted on pure instinct. As Cross raised his pistol to fire again at Daniel, she pulled her own trigger. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the dawn air, and Cross jerked as if struck by an invisible fist. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest with an expression of surprise, then toppled forward into the dirt. The strongbox fell from his nerveless fingers, spilling its contents across the ground. Catherine stared at what she had done, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped her pistol. She had killed a man. Catherine Walsh, former Boston schoolteacher, had taken a human life. "Catherine!" Daniel's voice snapped her back to reality. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head numbly, unable to find words. Daniel quickly checked to ensure. Cross was dead, then gathered up the scattered papers from the strongbox while keeping watch for the remaining gunman. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "The other one will be back with reinforcements soon." Catherine nodded, though she felt as if she were moving through a dream. Daniel helped her onto Luna, securing the precious documents in his saddlebags before mounting his own horse. As they rode away from the burning ranch house, Catherine looked back once at the place where Samuel had lived and dreamed and planned for their future together. The flames were consuming everything he had built, but the evidence of his murder and of Whitman's larger conspiracy was safe in Daniel's possession. "You did what you had to do," Daniel said quietly, as they put distance between themselves and the scene of violence. "Cross was a killer who would have murdered us both without hesitation." Catherine nodded, though the weight of what she had done settled heavily on her shoulders. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, but she had also saved Daniel's life and preserved the evidence they needed to bring Whitman to justice. As the sun rose over the Montana Territory, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Catherine Elizabeth Walsh rode toward an uncertain future, forever changed by the violence she had both witnessed and committed. But in her heart, she knew that Samuel's death was finally beginning. To be avenged, the documents they had recovered would be the key to exposing Whitman's crimes. But first, they needed to find somewhere safe to examine them and plan their next move. The real battle for justice was just beginning. Behind them, smoke rose from the ruins of Samuel's ranch house, a funeral pyre for the dreams that had died with him. But ahead lay the possibility of truth, justice, and perhaps even a new kind of future that Catherine was only beginning to imagine. The transformation of the grieving mail-order bride into an instrument of justice was complete. Now it remained to be seen whether that justice could triumph over the corruption and violence that had claimed Samuel Harrison's life. The abandoned mining cabin sat hidden in a narrow canyon 20 miles north of Millfield, accessible only by a treacherous trail that wound through jagged rocks and loose shale. Daniel had led them there as the sun climbed higher, knowing they needed a secure location to examine Samuel's documents and plan their next move. Catherine dismounted from Luna, with trembling legs, the adrenaline from the morning's violence finally fading and leaving her drained. The reality of what she had done, taking Jack Cross's life, hit her in waves, alternating between numbing shock and overwhelming guilt. "Drink this," Daniel said, offering her a flask of whiskey from his saddlebags. "It'll help with the shock." Catherine accepted the flask gratefully, the harsh liquor burning her throat but warming her chilled blood. "How do you bear it?" she asked quietly. "Killing someone?" Daniel's dark eyes were somber as he studied her face. "It never gets easier, if that's what you're asking. But Cross was a murderer who chose violence as his profession. You defended yourself and saved my life in the process." "I know that intellectually," Catherine replied, sinking onto a fallen log near the cabin's entrance. "But knowing it and feeling it are different things." "The fact that it troubles you proves you're not like them," Daniel said, sitting beside her. "Cross enjoyed killing. Whitman sees it as a business expense. You did what honor demanded, nothing more." Catherine nodded, though the weight in her chest remained. She watched as Daniel spread Samuel's recovered documents on a flat rock, organizing them by date and content. Even from a distance, she could see the careful, precise handwriting that she recognized from his letters. "What do they say?" she asked, forcing herself to focus on their mission rather than her inner turmoil. Daniel's expression grew grim as he read. "It's all here. Every conversation Whitman had with Samuel, every threat, every attempt at intimidation. He held up one particular sheet. This entry is from 2 weeks ago. Whitman told Samuel he had 3 days to accept his offer or face the consequences of his stubbornness. Catherine moved closer to read over his shoulder, her teacher's instincts automatically analyzing the careful documentation. Samuel was building a legal case against him. More than that, look at this. Daniel pointed to a series of entries from the previous month. Samuel wasn't just recording his own experiences. He was corresponding with other landowners who'd been pressured by Whitman. There's a whole network of evidence here. Names and dates, everything. Thomas Mueller's cattle poisoning, Sarah Hendricks's barn fire, Jim Patterson's mysterious accident that left him unable to work his land. Daniel's voice grew harder with each revelation. Whitman's been conducting a systematic campaign of terror across the entire valley. Catherine studied the documents, her mind racing with possibilities. This is enough to destroy him, isn't it? With this evidence, even corrupt officials would have to act. In theory, yes, but first we have to survive long enough to present it to the right authorities. As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon. Walls. Daniel immediately moved to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the wooden shutters. "Riders coming up the trail," he reported. "At least 6 of them." Catherine's stomach dropped. "Whitman's men? Has to be. Cross must have told them about this place before we left the ranch." Daniel began quickly gathering the documents. "We need to move now." But even as he spoke, they could hear that the riders had reached the narrow entrance to the canyon. There was no way out except through them. "The back of the cabin," Daniel said urgently. "There's a window we can climb through, then work our way up the canyon wall." Catherine looked at the steep rock face behind the cabin and felt her courage falter. The climb would be treacherous under the best circumstances, impossible for someone in her long skirts and unsuitable boots. "I can't climb that," she said, "not dressed like this." Daniel's jaw tightened as he calculated their options. The sound of approaching horses was getting closer. "Then we make our stand here. Against 6 men. We have advantages they don't. Expect. Superior position, knowledge of their intentions, and," he smiled grimly, "the righteous anger of 2 people who've seen too much injustice." Catherine felt a strange calm settle over her as she accepted their situation. She had killed once today. If necessary, she could do it again. "What do you need me to do?" Daniel's respect for her was evident in his eyes. "Take position at the side window with your pistol. I'll cover the front door with my rifle. Don't shoot unless you have a clear target. And remember, they want us alive if possible. Whitman needs to know what we've learned before he kills us." "Comforting," Catherine muttered, but she moved to her assigned position and checked her weapon. Voices of the approaching riders became clear as they reached the cabin clearing. Catherine recognized Sheriff Daniel's voice, along with several others she didn't know. "Harrison's woman and that half-breed are in there," Daniels called out. "We know you can hear us. Come out with your hands up, and we'll make this easy on you." Daniels' voice rang out strong and clear. "Sheriff Daniels, we have evidence of Ezra Whitman's involvement in Samuel Harrison's murder. Surrender now, and you might avoid hanging with him." Harsh laughter answered him. "Evidence? You mean the papers you stole from Harrison's place before burning it down? That's destruction of property and theft, not evidence." "The papers prove Whitman murdered Samuel Harrison and 6 other landowners," Catherine called out, surprising herself with her steady voice. "Are you willing to die protecting a killer, Sheriff?" A new voice answered, colder and more cultured than the others. "Miss Walsh, this is Ezra Whitman. I believe we've had enough of this charade." Catherine's blood chilled. Whitman himself had come to finish this personally. "You have something that belongs to me," Whitman continued. "Return it, and I'll ensure your deaths are quick and painless. Refuse, and I'll let my men take their time with you." Daniel caught Catherine's eye and mouthed silently, "Keep them talking." "Mr. Whitman," Catherine called back, "I have a proposition. For you, I'm listening. Single combat. Your best man against mine. Winner takes everything. The documents, our lives, everything." There was a moment of surprised silence before Whitman responded. "And why would I agree to such terms when I have you outnumbered?" "Because," Catherine said, improvising desperately, "this canyon has only one way in or out. If we're going to die here, we'll make sure to take several of your men with us." "How much are those documents really worth to you?" Daniel looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. It was a dangerous gambit, but it might give them a chance. Whitman's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Walsh. Very well. I accept your terms. My man against yours, pistols at 20 paces. "Who's your champion?" Daniel called out. "Tyler Morrison, the finest shot in the territory." Catherine's heart sank. She had heard the name. Morrison was a professional gunfighter with a reputation for never missing his target. "And your man?" Whitman asked. Daniel stepped into the doorway, his rifle held ready. "I'll speak for myself. The half-breed Apache, how delightfully appropriate, the savage defending the civilized lady's honor." The racial slur made Catherine's blood boil, but Daniel seemed unaffected. His voice remained calm as he replied, "Name the terms." "Simple enough. Pistols, 20 paces, turn and fire on my count. Winner takes the documents and the right to leave this canyon alive. And the loser dies where he falls. But the woman goes free either way, assuming she cooperates." Catherine knew Whitman was lying about letting her go, but she also knew Daniel was their only hope in a straight gunfight. She watched as he handed his rifle to her and checked his pistol. "Don't do this," she whispered urgently. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Daniel replied quietly. "Morrison is fast, but I've faced faster men and lived to tell about it. And if you lose—" Daniel's dark eyes met hers, and she saw in them a depth of feeling that made her breath catch. "Then you burn those documents rather than let Whitman have them. Promise me." "Daniel, promise me, Catherine." The use of her first name, spoken with such intensity, made her realize that somewhere in their shared danger and purpose, something deeper had grown between them. Something she was only now recognizing as she faced the possibility of losing it. "I promise," she whispered. Daniel nodded and stepped out of the cabin, his hands held away from his gun. "I'm coming out, Whitman." Catherine watched through the window as the drama unfolded in the small clearing. Whitman sat his horse like a king, presiding over court, flanked by his remaining men. Tyler Morrison dismounted, a lean, dangerous-looking man with pale eyes and the fluid movements of a professional killer. 20 paces, Whitman announced as the two men took their positions back-to-back in the center of the clearing. "Turn and fire when I reach 0. Catherine's heart hammered as she watched Daniel and Morrison begin their deadly walk, each step carrying them farther apart and closer to violence. She found herself praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening, bargaining her own life for Daniel's safety. 10, Whitman called out. Daniel's stride was steady, controlled, showing no sign of the tension he must be feeling. 5. Morrison's hand hovered near his gun, ready for the lightning-fast draw that had made him famous. 3. Catherine held, her breath, her finger tight on her own pistol's trigger. 2. Time seemed to slow as both men prepared to spin and fire. 1. The count never reached 0. Instead, a rifle shot cracked from the ridge above the canyon, and one of Whitman's men tumbled from his saddle. Another shot followed immediately, sending the horses into a panic and scattering the gunmen. "Apache!" someone shouted. "We're surrounded!" Catherine saw Mary Crowfeather's nephew rise from concealment among the rocks, his rifle already aimed at another target, but he wasn't alone. At least a dozen other figures appeared along the canyon rim, all armed and clearly hostile to Whitman's party. "Daniel!" Mary's voice called out in the Apache language, and Catherine saw Daniel dive for cover behind a large boulder as chaos erupted in the clearing. Whitman's men found themselves caught in a crossfire between the Apache warriors above and Daniel's position below. Catherine added her own fire to the battle, shooting at targets of opportunity while staying low behind the cabin's thick walls. Tyler Morrison, caught in the open during the duel preparation, tried to reach his horse, but was cut down by rifle fire from the ridge. Sheriff Daniels lasted only seconds longer before a bullet found him as well. The battle was brief but decisive. Within minutes, only Whitman remained alive, his horse dancing nervously as bullets whined around him. His face was a mask of rage and disbelief as he realized his carefully laid trap had become his own destruction. "This isn't over," he shouted toward the cabin. "I have friends in high places." "You'll never make those documents stick in court." Daniel rose from cover, his pistol trained on the corrupt businessman. "Maybe not in your courts, Whitman, but there are other kinds of justice." For a moment, Catherine thought Daniel might simply shoot Whitman down. The man had murdered Samuel and countless others and deserved no mercy. But Daniel surprised her. "You're going to confess," he said calmly. "In writing, every murder, every act of corruption, every dollar you've stolen from honest people." Whitman's laugh was bitter. "And if I refuse?" Daniel gestured toward the Apache warriors who were now descending into the canyon. "My aunt's people have their own laws concerning murder and theft. I can turn you over to them for justice under those laws, or you can take your chances with territorial authorities." The threat was clear. Whitman's face went pale as he contemplated. "Apache justice for the murders of their people. You wouldn't dare," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Wouldn't I?" Daniel's smile was cold. "You murdered my friend, threatened the woman I—" He paused, glancing toward Catherine. "You've earned whatever fate awaits you." Catherine felt her heart skip at his unfinished declaration, but forced herself to focus on the moment. They had won, against impossible odds, but the victory felt hollow knowing how many had died to reach this point. Mary Crowfeather approached the cabin, her weathered face showing satisfaction at the outcome. "My nephew," she said to Daniel in English, "you have honored Samuel Harrison's memory today." "It's not finished yet," Daniel replied. "Whitman still needs to face justice for his crimes." Mary's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Perhaps, but first there are others who would speak with him about his treatment of our people." Whitman's horse shied as several Apache warriors surrounded him, their faces showing no mercy for the man who had stolen their land and murdered their kin. "I'll confess," Whitman said desperately. "I'll sign whatever you want, just don't let them—" "You'll confess because it's the right thing to do," Catherine interrupted, stepping out of the cabin. "Because Samuel Harrison deserves justice, and because the people you've terrorized deserve to know the truth." Whitman stared at her with something approaching amazement. "You've changed, Miss Walsh. The frightened schoolteacher who arrived in Millfield is gone." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "She is, and in her place stands someone who won't be intimidated by men like you." As Mary's warriors secured Whitman for transport back to town, Catherine felt the weight of the morning's events settling on her shoulders. She had killed a man, survived a gunfight, and helped bring down a criminal empire. More importantly, she had found her own strength and discovered feelings for Daniel that complicated everything she thought she knew about her future. The crucible of violence and danger had forged her into someone new, someone stronger than she had ever imagined possible. But with that strength came responsibility and choices that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who called the Montana Territory home. Samuel Harrison's death had been avenged, but Catherine Walsh's story was far from over. In fact, as she looked at Daniel Crowfeather and saw the warmth in his dark eyes, she realized it might just be beginning. The return to Millfield was unlike anything Catherine could have imagined when she first arrived on that fateful train. Just days ago, now she rode at the head of a procession that would forever change the balance of power in the Montana Territory. Beside her, Daniel sat tall in his saddle, Samuel's recovered documents safely secured in weatherproof pouches. Behind them, Mary Crowfeather's warriors escorted a bound and defeated Ezra Whitman, while curious townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses to witness the extraordinary sight. Word of their approach had spread quickly through the small frontier community. By the time they reached Main Street, nearly every resident of Millfield had gathered to watch the man who had terrorized them for years being brought to justice by the most unlikely coalition imaginable. A Boston schoolteacher, a half Apache, rancher, and a band of warriors seeking their own justice. Catherine could see the mixture of emotions on the faces in the crowd. Relief warred with disbelief. Hope struggled against years of ingrained fear. Many seemed unable to accept that Whitman's reign of terror was truly over. They stopped first at the Territorial Courthouse, a modest two-story building that served as the center of official authority in Millfield. Judge Morrison stood on the front steps, his face pale with shock as he took in the scene before him. Behind him, several other town officials clustered nervously, clearly uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented situation. "Judge Morrison," Daniel called out formally, "we bring Ezra Whitman to face charges of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. We have substantial evidence to support these charges." Judge Morrison's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "This is highly irregular. I'll need to review the evidence and determine if charges are warranted." "The evidence is overwhelming," Catherine interrupted, her voice carrying the authority she had developed as a teacher addressing unruly students. "Mr. Whitman has confessed to the murder of Samuel Harrison and multiple other crimes. The confession is signed and witnessed." She dismounted from Luna and approached the steps, pulling the signed confession from her saddlebag. The document was still damp with Whitman's nervous sweat from where he had signed it under the watchful eyes of Mary's warriors. Judge Morrison accepted the papers with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the damning contents. As he read, his face grew increasingly ashen. Catherine could practically see him calculating the political ramifications of Whitman's downfall and his own potential exposure. This is quite serious," the judge stammered. "I'll need time to review the evidence properly, consult with territorial authorities." "Judge Morrison," Mary Crowfeather interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of generations of authority, "my nephew tells me you are an honest man, despite your son's employment with the accused. Is this true?" The directness of the question seemed to steady the judge somewhat. He straightened his shoulders and looked Mary in the eye. "I try to be, ma'am, though I'll admit I haven't always been as brave as I should have been." "Courage can be learned," Mary replied. "Today would be a good day to begin practicing it." "Judge." Morrison nodded slowly, then turned to address the growing crowd. "People of Millfield," he called out, his voice growing stronger, "based on the evidence presented, I am issuing a warrant for the arrest of Ezra Whitman on charges of murder in the first degree, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption of public officials." A murmur ran through the crowd, part relief, part disbelief that someone was finally willing to stand up to Whitman publicly. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am calling for a full investigation into all land transactions and business dealings conducted by Mr. Whitman and his associates during his time in our territory." Whitman, who had remained silent during the proceedings, finally spoke up. "You're making a mistake, Morrison. I have powerful friends who won't tolerate this treatment. When word reaches the territorial capital, your friends in the capital will be very interested to learn about your activities," Catherine interrupted. She pulled another set of documents from her bag, correspondence Daniel had found among Samuel's papers. "These letters detail your bribes to territorial officials, your illegal land acquisitions, and your conspiracy to defraud the Railroad Development Commission." Whitman's face went white, as he recognized the implications. His network of corruption extended far beyond Millfield, and exposure here would trigger investigations that could topple officials throughout the territory. "You don't understand what you're unleashing," he said desperately. "The territory needs development, progress. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions." "Murder is not a difficult decision," Daniel said coldly. "It's a crime, and you've committed it repeatedly." Dr. Peters, the town physician, stepped forward from the crowd. He had been notably absent during the events of recent days, and Catherine could see guilt written across his weathered features. "Judge Morrison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to make a statement regarding the death of Samuel Harrison." The crowd grew silent, sensing the importance of what was about to be revealed. "I falsified the cause of death on Mr. Harrison's certificate," Dr. Peters continued, his words falling like stones into the silence. "Mr. Whitman's man Cross threatened my family if I didn't rule it natural causes. I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid." The admission sent shockwaves through the assembled townspeople. Catherine felt a surge of vindication mixed with sadness, for the fear that had kept good people silent while evil flourished. "Dr. Peters," Judge Morrison said formally, "are you willing to testify to these facts under oath?" "Yes, sir." It's time the truth came out. More voices began to emerge from the crowd. Thomas Mueller stepped forward to describe the poisoning of his cattle. Sarah Hendricks spoke about the mysterious fire that had destroyed her barn. One by one, Whitman's victims found the courage to tell their stories publicly, each account adding weight to the case against him. Catherine watched this outpouring of testimony with amazement. These people had suffered in silence for years, but seeing Whitman bound and powerless had finally given them the courage to speak truth to power. Mrs. Cooper pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with excitement and righteous anger. "Judge Morrison, I've got something to add to this testimony." She produced a small leather ledger from her apron pocket. "Whitman's been having meetings in my hotel for months, thinking I was too simple to understand what they were talking about. But I kept notes of everything I overheard." The ledger contained a devastating record of conversations between Whitman and various officials, detailing bribes, threats, and planned accidents for uncooperative landowners. It was additional evidence that would make conviction virtually certain. As the afternoon wore on, a steady stream of witnesses came forward. Each story revealed another facet of Whitman's criminal enterprise, painting a picture of systematic corruption that had infected every level of territorial government. Deputy Marshal Bradley, who had been notably quiet during the proceedings, finally approached Judge Morrison with obvious reluctance. "Your Honor," he said, "I received a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office. They're sending a special prosecutor to handle this case. Should be here by tomorrow." Catherine felt a chill of concern. "Is that good news or bad news?" Bradley looked uncomfortable. "Hard to say, miss. Could go either way, depending on who they send and what instructions they bring." Daniel's expression was grim. "Whitman's friends in high places will try to control the prosecution. We need to be prepared for that." Mary Crow Feather, who had been observing the proceedings with keen interest, spoke up. "My people have little faith in white man's justice, but we will watch these proceedings carefully. If this court fails to deliver justice, we will seek it through our own methods." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If the territorial authorities attempted to cover up Whitman's crimes or engineer his escape, they would face the wrath of the Apache bands who had their own grievances against him. Judge Morrison seemed to understand the implications. "Mrs. Crow Feather, I give you my word that justice will be served in this case. Mr. Whitman will face trial for his crimes." "See that he does," Mary replied. "My nephew has shed blood for justice. It would be unfortunate if that sacrifice were wasted." As evening approached, temporary arrangements were made for Whitman's confinement. The town jail was small and not particularly secure, so Judge Morrison arranged for a rotating guard of volunteers to ensure the prisoner couldn't escape or be mysteriously rescued by remaining allies. Catherine found herself standing outside the courthouse as the crowd began to disperse, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The events of the past few days felt surreal, like something from one of the adventure novels she had read as a child rather than her own life. "Quite a transformation," Daniel said quietly, appearing beside her. "What do you mean?" The woman who stepped off the train 4 days ago wouldn't have recognized the woman standing here now. Catherine considered this observation. He was right, of course. The frightened, grieving mail-order bride who had arrived seeking a new life had been replaced by someone she barely recognized, someone capable of violence, leadership, and moral courage she had never known she possessed. "I'm not sure I recognize her myself," she admitted. "Sometimes I wonder what Samuel would think of what I've become." "I think he would be proud," Daniel replied. "You've honored his memory by seeking justice for his death, but more than that, you've found your own strength." They walked together toward the hotel, where Mrs. Cooper had prepared a celebratory dinner for the key participants in Whitman's downfall. As they moved through the twilight streets, Catherine was aware of the looks they were receiving from townspeople. Some grateful, some curious, some still uncertain about the changes that were coming to their community. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait for the territorial prosecutor and hope he's honest. We prepare our case and make sure Whitman faces real consequences for his crimes." "And after that?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "After that, you'll have choices to make about your future, about what kind of life you want to build here." There was something in his tone that made Catherine's heart race. She stopped walking and turned to face him in the gathering darkness. "Daniel, what are you trying to say?" He took her hands in his dark eyes serious in the lamplight from a nearby window. "I'm saying that somewhere in all this violence and danger, something has grown between us, something I never expected to feel again." Catherine's breath caught. She had been aware of her growing feelings for Daniel, but hearing him acknowledge them made everything suddenly real and immediate. "Samuel has been dead less than a week," she said quietly. "Isn't it wrong to feel this way so soon?" "Love doesn't follow schedules or social conventions," Daniel replied. "And what we have isn't a betrayal of Samuel's memory. If anything, I think he would want you to be happy, would he? Sometimes I feel like I'm dishonoring what we might have had together." Daniel cupped her face gently in his hands. "Catherine, you never had the chance to love Samuel as a real person. You loved the idea of him, the hope he represented. What you feel for me is different. It's based on who we really are, tested by shared danger and mutual respect." The truth of his words resonated through her. Her feelings for Samuel had been based on letters and dreams, while her connection to Daniel had been forged in fire and violence, built on genuine understanding and shared purpose. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Everything is changing so fast. A week ago, I was a spinster schoolteacher with a quiet, predictable life. Now I'm someone who kills people and brings down criminal conspiracies. What if I don't know who I really am anymore? Then we'll figure it out together," Daniel said simply, "if you want to." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment. A small group of riders was entering town from the east, their formal bearing and official dress marking them as government representatives. The territorial prosecutor, Daniel observed grimly. Earlier than expected. They watched as the riders dismounted in front of the courthouse. The lead figure was a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit, flanked by what appeared to be federal marshals. "We should see what this is about," Catherine said, though part of her wanted to stay in this moment of possibility with Daniel, rather than face whatever new complications were arriving. They joined the crowd, gathering around the courthouse steps as Judge Morrison emerged to greet the newcomers. The lead prosecutor introduced himself as Federal District Attorney James Wellington, sent directly from the territorial capital to handle the Whitman case. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wellington announced to the assembled crowd, "I want you to know that the territorial government takes these allegations very seriously. Mr. Whitman will receive a fair trial, and if convicted, he will face the full penalty of the law." The words sounded reassuring, but something in Wellington's manner made Catherine uneasy. There was a political smoothness to him that reminded her uncomfortably of Whitman himself. "However," Wellington continued, "I must caution everyone that accusations are not proof. Mr. Whitman is entitled to the presumption of innocence, and any evidence against him must meet strict legal standards." Daniel stepped forward from the crowd. "Mr. Wellington, we have documented confessions, eyewitness testimony, and physical evidence of Mr. Whitman's crimes." Wellington's gaze fixed on Daniel with unmistakable prejudice. "And you are?" "Daniel Crow Feather. I was a friend of Samuel Harrison and instrumental in gathering evidence against Whitman." "I see. Well, Mr. Crow Feather, while I appreciate your civic involvement, the prosecution of this case will be handled by trained legal professionals. Vigilante justice has no place in a civilized territory." The dismissive tone and barely concealed racism in Wellington's response set Catherine's teeth on edge. She stepped forward, her teacher's voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Mr. Wellington, are you suggesting that citizens have no right to seek justice when the authorities fail to protect them?" Wellington turned his attention to her, his expression softening slightly as he took in her appearance and refined speech. "Miss Catherine Walsh, I was Samuel Harrison's intended bride, and I've been instrumental in uncovering the evidence against Whitman." "Ah, yes, the mail-order bride. I was told about your involvement." Wellington's tone was patronizing. "I'm sure this has all been very traumatic for you, miss. Perhaps it would be best if you left the legal proceedings to those qualified to handle them." Catherine felt her temper flare. After everything she had been through, everything she had discovered and fought for, this pompous official was trying to dismiss her as an hysterical woman who should quietly step aside. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "I have risked my life to gather evidence of Whitman's crimes. I have documentation that proves his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. If you think I'm going to quietly step aside while you conduct some sham trial designed to protect his political connections, you are very much mistaken." Wellington's face flushed at being challenged so directly by a woman in front of the entire town. "Miss Walsh, I understand you're upset, but—" "Upset?" Catherine's voice rose. "Mr. Wellington, Ezra Whitman murdered the man I came here to marry. He's terrorized this entire community for years. He bribed officials, stolen land, and killed anyone who stood in his way. If you're not prepared to prosecute him to the full extent of the law, then perhaps we need to find someone who will." The crowd murmured its agreement, and Catherine could see that her words had struck home. These people had finally found their voice, and they weren't going to be silenced by another corrupt official. Wellington seemed to realize that he had underestimated both Catherine and the mood of the community. "Of course justice will be served," he said quickly. "I simply want to ensure that all proper procedures are followed." "Good," Catherine replied. "Then you won't object to public oversight of the proceedings. This community has suffered enough from justice conducted in secret." As the crowd began to disperse, Catherine felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Mary Crow Feather, regarding her with something that might have been pride. "You speak well for justice," the older woman said. "My nephew chose his ally wisely." Catherine felt a warmth spread through her at the compliment. She had found her voice and her strength, but more than that, she had found her purpose. Samuel's death would not be in vain, and Ezra Whitman would face the consequences of his crimes. But as she watched Federal District Attorney Wellington conferring quietly with his marshals, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle for justice was just beginning. Whitman's capture was only the first step. Making sure he actually faced consequences for his crimes would require all the courage and determination she had discovered within herself. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Millfield seeking a new life had indeed found one, not as Samuel, Harrison's wife, but as Catherine Walsh, seeker of justice and defender of the innocent. And if District Attorney Wellington thought he could steamroll over her and this community, he was about to learn just how formidable a determined woman could be. 3 months later, Catherine stood at the window of the newly rebuilt schoolhouse, watching her students play in the crisp winter air. The sound of their laughter carried across the snow-covered playground, a joyful contrast to the grim events that had transformed Millfield the previous autumn. The trial of Ezra Whitman had concluded just 2 weeks ago, and Catherine still felt a deep satisfaction when she remembered the moment Judge Morrison read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Despite District Attorney Wellington's initial attempts to negotiate a plea bargain that would have allowed Whitman to escape with a light sentence, the overwhelming evidence and public pressure had forced a full prosecution. The key breakthrough had come when one of Wellington's own assistants, a young lawyer named Robert Hayes, had approached Catherine privately with concerns about his superior's conduct. Hayes had discovered communications between Wellington and territorial officials that revealed a plan to minimize Whitman's sentence in exchange for his silence about corruption in the territorial government. Catherine smiled as she remembered the scene in the courthouse when she had confronted Wellington with this evidence before a packed gallery of townspeople. The federal prosecutor's careful political facade had crumbled completely, and within days he had been replaced by an honest prosecutor from the Territorial Supreme Court. Whitman now faced 25 years in the territorial prison, and his vast network of corrupt associates throughout Montana Territory was being systematically dismantled by federal investigators. More importantly for Millfield, the town was finally free to grow and prosper without the shadow of fear that had dominated it for so long. "Miss Walsh?" A small voice interrupted her thoughts. Catherine turned to see Jenny Morrison, the judge's 8-year-old granddaughter, holding up a slate with carefully practiced letters. "I finished my writing exercise," Jenny announced proudly. Catherine examined the slate, noting the improvement in the child's penmanship since the beginning of the school term. "Excellent work, Jenny. Your letters are getting much neater." The little girl beamed at the praise. Like many of the children in Millfield, Jenny had flourished since the community had emerged from Whitman's oppression. Her grandfather, Judge Morrison, had proved to be a fair and honest administrator once freed from the threat of Whitman's influence, and the whole family seemed lighter and happier. "Miss Walsh," Jenny said with the directness that only children possessed, "are you going to marry Mr. Crow Feather?" Catherine felt her cheeks warm at the question. The relationship between her and Daniel had been the subject of considerable speculation in the small community, though they had been deliberately careful about public displays of affection while the wounds from recent events were still healing. "What makes you ask that, Jenny?" "My man says you look at him the way ladies look at men they want to marry, and he built you that bookshelf for the schoolhouse even though you didn't ask him to." Catherine glanced at the beautiful oak bookshelf that now graced one wall of the classroom, every joint perfectly fitted and the wood polished to a warm glow. Daniel had appeared with it one morning 3 weeks ago, claiming that a proper school needed proper furniture. He had spent 2 days installing it and organizing her books, working quietly while she taught classes and pretending not to notice the appreciative glances she kept giving him. "Mr. Crow Feather is a very kind man," Catherine said diplomatically. "Now, shouldn't you be helping Martha with her arithmetic?" "I'm scared," she admitted. "Everything is changing so fast. A week ago, I was a spinster schoolteacher with a quiet, predictable life. Now I'm someone who kills people and brings down criminal conspiracies. What if I don't know who I really am?" "Any more? Then we'll figure it out together," Daniel said simply. "If you want to." Before Catherine could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their moment. A small group of riders was entering town from the east, their formal bearing and official dress marking them as government representatives. "The territorial prosecutor," Daniel observed grimly. Earlier than expected, they watched as the riders dismounted in front of the courthouse. The lead figure was a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit, flanked by what appeared to be federal marshals. "We should see what this is about," Catherine said, though part of her wanted to stay in this moment of possibility with Daniel. Rather than face whatever new complications were arriving, they joined the crowd, gathering around the courthouse steps as Judge Morrison emerged to greet the newcomers. The lead prosecutor introduced himself as Federal District Attorney James Wellington, sent directly from the territorial capital to handle the Whitman case. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wellington announced to the assembled crowd, "I want you to know that the territorial government takes these allegations very seriously. Mr. Whitman will receive a fair trial, and if convicted, he will face the full penalty of the law." The words sounded reassuring, but something in Wellington's manner made Catherine uneasy. There was a political smoothness to him that reminded her uncomfortably of Whitman himself. "However," Wellington continued, "I must caution everyone that accusations are not proof. Mr. Whitman is entitled to the presumption of innocence, and any evidence against him must meet strict legal standards." Daniel stepped forward from the crowd. "Mr. Wellington, we have documented confessions, eyewitness testimony, and physical evidence of Mr. Whitman's crimes." Wellington's gaze fixed on Daniel with unmistakable prejudice. "And you are?" "Daniel Crowfeather. I was a friend of Samuel Harrison and instrumental in gathering evidence against Whitman." "I see. Well, Mr. Crowfeather, while I appreciate your civic involvement, the prosecution of this case will be handled by trained legal professionals. Vigilante justice has no place in a civilized territory." The dismissive tone and barely concealed racism in Wellington's response set Catherine's teeth on edge. She stepped forward, her teacher's voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Mr. Wellington, are you suggesting that citizens have no right to seek justice when the authorities fail to protect them?" Wellington turned his attention to her, his expression softening slightly as he took in her appearance and refined speech. "Miss Catherine Walsh, I was Samuel Harrison's intended bride, and I've been instrumental in uncovering the evidence against Whitman." "Ah, yes, the mail-order bride. I was told about your involvement." Wellington's tone was patronizing. "I'm sure this has all been very traumatic for you, miss. Perhaps it would be best if you left the legal proceedings to those qualified to handle them." Catherine felt her temper flare. After everything she had been through, everything she had discovered and fought for, this pompous official was trying to dismiss her as an hysterical woman who should quietly step aside. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "I have risked my life to gather evidence of Whitman's crimes. I have documentation that proves his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. If you think I'm going to quietly step aside while you conduct some sham trial designed to protect his political connections, you are very much mistaken." Wellington's face flushed at being challenged so directly by a woman in front of the entire town. "Miss Walsh, I understand you're upset, but—" "Upset?" Catherine's voice rose. "Mr. Wellington, Ezra Whitman murdered the man I came here to marry. He's terrorized this entire community for years. He bribed officials, stolen land, and killed anyone who stood in his way. If you're not prepared to prosecute him to the full extent of the law, then perhaps we need to find someone who will." The crowd murmured its agreement, and Catherine could see that her words had struck home. These people had finally found their voice, and they weren't going to be silenced by another corrupt official. Wellington seemed to realize that he had underestimated both Catherine and the mood of the community. "Of course justice will be served," he said quickly. "I simply want to ensure that all proper procedures are followed." "Good," Catherine replied. "Then you won't object to public oversight of the proceedings. This community has suffered enough from justice conducted in secret." As the crowd began to disperse, Catherine felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Mary Crow Feather regarding her with something that might have been pride. "You speak well for justice," the older woman said. "My nephew chose his ally wisely." Catherine felt a warmth spread through her at the compliment. She had found her voice and her strength, but more than that, she had found her purpose. Samuel's death would not be in vain, and Ezra Whitman would face the consequences of his crimes. But as she watched Federal District Attorney Wellington conferring quietly with his marshals, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle for justice was just beginning. Whitman's capture was only the first step. Making sure he actually faced consequences for his crimes would require all the courage and determination she had discovered within herself. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Millfield seeking a new life had indeed found one. Not as Samuel, Harrison's wife, but as Catherine Walsh, seeker of justice and defender of the innocent. And if District Attorney Wellington thought he could steamroll over her and this community, he was about to learn just how formidable a determined woman could be. 3 months later, Catherine stood at the window of the newly rebuilt schoolhouse, watching her students play in the crisp winter air. The sound of their laughter carried across the snow-covered playground, a joyful contrast to the grim events that had transformed Millfield the previous autumn. The trial of Ezra Whitman had concluded just 2 weeks ago, and Catherine still felt a deep satisfaction when she remembered the moment Judge Morrison read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Despite District Attorney Wellington's initial attempts to negotiate a plea bargain that would have allowed Whitman to escape with a light sentence, the overwhelming evidence and public pressure had forced a full prosecution. The key breakthrough had come when one of Wellington's own assistants, a young lawyer named Robert Hayes, had approached Catherine privately with concerns about his superior's conduct. Hayes had discovered communications between Wellington and territorial officials that revealed a plan to minimize Whitman's sentence in exchange for his silence about corruption in the territorial government. Catherine smiled as she remembered the scene in the courthouse when she had confronted Wellington with this evidence before a packed gallery of townspeople. The federal prosecutor's careful political facade had crumbled completely, and within days he had been replaced by an honest prosecutor from the territorial Supreme Court. Whitman now faced 25 years in the territorial prison, and his vast network of corrupt associates throughout Montana Territory was being systematically dismantled by federal investigators. More importantly for Millfield, the town was finally free to grow and prosper without the shadow of fear that had dominated it for so long. "Miss Walsh?" A small voice interrupted her thoughts. Catherine turned to see Jenny Morrison, the judge's 8-year-old granddaughter, holding up a slate with carefully practiced letters. "I finished my writing exercise," Jenny announced proudly. Catherine examined the slate, noting the improvement in the child's penmanship since the beginning of the school term. "Excellent work, Jenny. Your letters are getting much neater." The little girl beamed at the praise. Like many of the children in Millfield, Jenny had flourished since the community had emerged from Whitman's oppression. Her grandfather, Judge Morrison, had proved to be a fair and honest administrator once freed from the threat of Whitman's influence, and the whole family seemed lighter and happier. "Miss Walsh," Jenny said with the directness that only children possessed, "are you going to marry Mr. Crow Feather?" Catherine felt her cheeks warm at the question. The relationship between her and Daniel had been the subject of considerable speculation in the small community, though they had been deliberately careful about public displays of affection while the wounds from recent events were still healing. "What makes you ask that, Jenny?" "My man says you look at him the way ladies look at men they want to marry, and he built you that bookshelf for the schoolhouse, even though you didn't ask him to." Catherine glanced at the beautiful oak bookshelf that now graced one wall of the classroom, every joint perfectly fitted and the wood polished to a warm glow. Daniel had appeared with it one morning 3 weeks ago, claiming that a proper school needed proper furniture. He had spent 2 days installing it and organizing her books, working quietly while she taught classes and pretending not to notice the appreciative glances she kept giving him. "Mr. Crowfeather is a very kind man," Catherine said diplomatically. "Now, shouldn't you be helping Martha with her arithmetic?" Jenny giggled and scampered away, but her innocent question lingered in Catherine's mind. The truth was that she and Daniel had grown closer with each passing week, but they had deliberately taken their relationship slowly. Both of them understood that what they felt for each other needed time to develop without the pressure of the dramatic circumstances that had brought them together. "Now I know that what we have is real. It's been tested by everything we've faced together, and it's only grown stronger." Catherine smiled through her tears. "Yes, Daniel. Yes to being partners in everything. Yes to fighting this legal challenge together. Yes to building a future in this place we've both come to love." Daniel dismounted and helped her down from Luna, then took her in his arms for their first real kiss. It was tender and passionate and full of promise, a seal on the partnership they were choosing to build together. When they finally broke apart, Catherine felt as though her life had finally found its true direction. She had come to Montana Territory as a mail-order bride seeking a conventional marriage and a quiet life. Instead, she had discovered her own strength, found her true calling as a fighter for justice, and fallen in love with a man who valued her as an equal partner in every way. "So, what's our first step in fighting this federal challenge?" she asked practically. Daniel grinned at her immediate return to business. "First, we get married. If we're going to take on the federal government, we should do it as husband and wife." "That's rather sudden, isn't it?" "Catherine, we've known each other for 3 months under the most intense circumstances imaginable. We've fought together, risked our lives together, and fallen in love while bringing down a criminal conspiracy. If that's not enough basis for marriage, I don't know what is." Catherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks, despite the legal challenges ahead. "You make a compelling argument, Mr. Crowfeather." "I try to be persuasive when it matters. In that case," Catherine said, standing on her toes to kiss him again, "I suppose we should talk to Judge Morrison about performing a ceremony." As they rode the final distance into Millfield, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had left Boston as Catherine Walsh, a spinster schoolteacher seeking security and respectability. She would soon become Catherine Crowfeather, a wife and partner in the most important fight of her life. The federal challenge to Whitman's conviction would be the ultimate test of everything they had built together. But Catherine felt ready for that fight. She had discovered reserves of courage and determination she never knew she possessed. She had found her voice as an advocate for justice. Most importantly, she had found a partner who valued her mind and spirit as much as her heart. Samuel Harrison's death had brought her west, but Daniel Crowfeather would be her future. Together, they would fight for justice, not just in Millfield, but in the halls of power in Washington, where corrupt officials thought they could overturn verdicts that threatened their interests. The mail-order bride's journey was complete. Catherine Walsh's life was just beginning. As they reached the hotel where Mrs. Cooper waited with dinner and probably a dozen questions about their obvious happiness, Catherine felt a profound sense of completion. She had found her place in the world, her purpose and her person. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the strength she had discovered in herself and the love she had found with Daniel. The Montana Territory stretched around them, vast and beautiful and full of possibilities. Their future lay before them like an unwritten book, ready to be filled with adventure, love, and the ongoing fight for justice that had brought them together. Catherine Elizabeth Walsh had come west, seeking a new life. Catherine Walsh Crowfeather had found one beyond her wildest dreams. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.